Hi everyone, welcome back to Book Club Friday. I'm very excited for this week. I've been looking forward to it a lot. So I chose a play this week because with everything that's going on in the world right now with COVID-19, one of the things being affected a lot is the theater community, especially in New York. I just really wanted to raise some awareness for the arts industry in New York, which, I know a lot of people and their jobs are getting hit very hard. That is something that is getting hit especially hard. Writers, actors, crew, there's so many people involved in this community that play such an essential role to New York culture, that I just really wanted to raise some awareness around that. And I also just thought reading a play would be really fun. So Broadway Cares is an initiative that supports the social service work of the Actors Fund to fight HIV and AIDS, which is incredible. But they're also doing something especially amazing right now, which is they've set up a COVID relief fund. So they are giving money to some of the theater employees and artists during this time with COVID who are being affected, and those COVID-related expenses. So I think that everything that Broadway Cares is doing is incredible all year, especially right now. You guys are amazing. So you can learn more about it with the link that's been in my bio all week. I'll keep that in there. It's super interesting. I think you guys should read on it and, help where you can. It's the little things that go a long way with stuff like this. So I think we should talk a little bit about the play that we read, which is Spring Awakening. Now, I know this is a very famous play and musical, but I had actually never read it or seen it, and I am a big musical theater dork and theater dork in general. If you guys saw, Tommy and I did a live for the Ali Forney Center, which is another incredible charity that we both work with. We did a number from Rent, so that probably showed my sort of dorky theater side that I've always just loved plays. And that was like when I first started going to New York, that was the only thing I cared about doing, was going and seeing shows on Broadway. So doing a play was super exciting, especially one that I have not read yet. So we did Spring Awakening, and I did my research as a good book club member does when reading something, and it was super interesting because I found out when this first came into stage production, it was super controversial in Europe and in the US, because it touches on things like sexuality, growing up, challenging authority, questioning religion, things that were really not open to conversation at the time that this play came out. So there's so much to talk about. I'm actually going to be bringing on my friend Tommy Dorfman, who is an actor himself, and Tommy actually did a play about a year ago called Daddy that I went and saw by Jeremy O'Harris, who, shout out Jeremy, is an incredible playwright and writer in general, and Tommy's an incredible actor, and he advocates a lot for some of the issues covered in this book, so I thought he would be the perfect person to bring on for this week. He's also one of my best friends, so I'm very excited to talk to him. But before that, I want to talk a little bit more about the book, and about some of the topics covered in the book, and also share some quotes. So the subtitle of this book is actually A Children's Tragedy, and that's because it centers around a group of students who are raised to be religious, and that kind of causes them to be uneducated about sexuality or sex in general, and it really touches on the hypocrisy of that system, because how being judgmental and living by outdated rules can actually be very hurtful, especially when you're in these developmental stages of your life, and it affects these kids in the play in some of the most traumatic ways possible. So it sounds dark, but it's still very relevant, I think, to some of the issues we're facing today. I know we have come a very long way, but there are people still facing these issues, especially, people within the LGBTQ plus community, how they are being mistreated in religious schools and in certain places throughout the world, even in our own country, and how women's reproductive rights, especially for young girls, conversations around that can seem taboo, but I also think it's something very important to discuss, and this play that was one of the first things that openly talked about these sort of issues, and that's I think why it was very controversial, but also so relevant to the times now, and I think will be relevant forever. So I quickly wanted to share a few of my favorite quotes, and I also wanted to take some of your guys' questions before I bring Tommy on here. And I know Tommy and I can talk about anything forever, but especially when it comes to something like a play, we will definitely get into it. So first, I'm going to read some of my favorite quotes. This one is more on authority and how it affects these kids. So it says, "Don't you agree, Melchior, that a human being's sense of shame is merely a product of his upbringing?" Now, this quote, I think, is extremely true and extremely relevant. How, you know, the nature versus nurture, but also just, I feel very fortunate to be raised by a very open-minded family, and I think you are the product of your environment. So, you know, it's really painful for me to think about the fact that there are children being raised by families that maybe kind of implant these ideas in their head at a very young age that who they are is not okay. And so I think that can cause a sense of fear, of not feeling safe or like there's a place for you within your own family or within the world. So I think, yeah, how these shameful ideas that we get are really put on us by the people surrounding us. Another one I think that was really good is on religion. It says, "We see God and the devil blaming each other and cherish the unspeakable belief that both of them are drunk." I thought that was a great quote on religion, especially coming from these kids who were surrounded by such religious families and in a very religious school. So I really loved that kind of way of jabbing back at these religious ideas. This one's on morality and desire and kind of balancing that. And it says, "Morals I understand to be the real product of two imaginary quantities. The imaginary quantities are supposed to and want to. The product is called morals, and its reality cannot be denied." Now, I like this idea of sort of the angel and the devil on your shoulder, this fight between your mind and your heart sometimes, or what you want to do, or technically what you're supposed to do, or what you think you're supposed to do. I think that's something we all struggle with every day, that balance of want versus supposed to. So another quote, and this is the last one, on growing up that I really loved. I pulled this from the play as well. It says, "And now I've come, I don't know how, and I'm supposed to be responsible for not having stayed away." Now, that I really liked because I especially feel like when you're a teenager, you start to feel like, why am I on this world? What's my purpose? You know, and you feel this sense of responsibility for yourself that you didn't really have before. I think when you're young, it's like your parents are responsible for you. So you don't have this sort of taking credibility for your actions, things like that. So suddenly you start to question, why am I here? And I am here. So now I'm responsible for understanding why and also proving why I'm supposed to be here. And you know, we don't control when we get brought into this world and who brings us into this world, but suddenly it becomes our responsibility to do what we can with our time here. Now, I want to take a few questions from you guys because I really love when you guys leave questions for me, and I just think this was a really cool play to read because it is from a very long time ago, but reading it, you just realize how relevant these issues still are and will forever be. And it opens up so much conversation that, you know, would not have been talked about at that time. So I think I'm very, very privileged to be able to talk about it now with you guys. So if you guys have any questions, please leave those for me. I'm getting a lot of what's the play called? It's Spring Awakening. If you guys haven't read it, but or watched it, it's a very, very good. Someone said, "What's your favorite play you've ever read or seen?" Gosh, I truly could never ever choose. Recently was Slave Play, which was another one of Jeremy O. Harris's plays, which I cannot say enough incredible things about. Favorite character. My favorite character, you know, in some ways, I think probably Melchior, because he is very forward thinking and he kind of goes against what everyone's telling him to, and you know, at a time when that was not welcome for a child or a teenager or whoever to have these opinions, these very strong views on the world. I think his point of view was very important and essential to the play. Are there any other questions that you guys might have? Sorry, I'm trying to read your guys' questions. I think another character actually that I just think is worth mentioning is Wendla, who really gets hit very hard by her lack of knowledge for these for sex and sexuality and what that means, and the consequences that we have to face by being uneducated. And I think that's very true to every form of life. You know, we are responsible for our own education now, especially with everything that is available to us at this time. So at that time there wasn't the internet, so she couldn't go and look up these questions that she had to rely on her parents. So this sort of like withholding of information actually was very essential to her downfall, and I think it's very important to talk about that. Your favorite part in the play. I think my favorite part of the play is at the end when Melchior is giving reasons sort of to come with him to the other side, but it's also in a weird way turns around and becomes why you should live. And there's a beautiful song, shout out Tommy for showing me this song, that plays at the end of the musical that talks about how life goes on despite the tragedy that we face, how flowers still bloom, how you know, the world keeps turning. And I'm gonna bring Tommy on to talk about that because he showed me that song and that was really beautiful. How would you define loss of innocence, since it was one of the central ideas in the play? That's a very, very good question. I think loss of innocence goes very hand in hand with loss of ignorance, when you can no longer claim ignorance to some of these things. I don't necessarily think something has to happen to you that takes away your innocence. I think you're very much in control of it, and that's something that I've very much so believed in. But I do think it's when you start to sort of understand that your actions have consequences, what those consequences may be, and when you start to educate yourself on maybe the harder things that, you know, these parents don't even want to talk to their children about in this play. I'm trying to keep up with your guys' questions. I think, you know what, I think I want to bring Tommy on here because speaking of plays and things like this, he is an expert. So Tommy, let's get you on here. I'm so excited. Ah!
Did it work?
Yes, she's here.
Wow. Hi.
You look so beautiful. You always look so beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
I need
you
to step
gorgeous.
up my makeup game though. Wow.
I mean, listen, all it takes is a colored pencil.
This is my canvas.
And some blush.
It is. The blush is very spring. I love it.
I also feel like the dress you're wearing. Okay, so I've seen this musical now, and I saw the musical version of Spring Awakening, and then I read the play, and the dress you're wearing feels like very reminiscent of the dresses like the girls wear in the first scene.
I really wanted to channel it the best way, so thank
You're
you.
really
I'm
fucking
dressing on
channeling.
theme. Is that the shirt that we bought together?
Yeah, yeah.
I
Mhm.
love.
Under a dress I got on Amazon.
Wow. Thank God for Amazon right now.
Look,
Thanks for
really.
coming on here. I love
Thanks
you
for
so
having me.
much.
I love you. This
This
is
was the
such.
perfect thing for us to do.
It really is. I love that you have this book club to sort of like stay active and stay educated and keeping people inspired. It's so amazing.
Yeah. Well, you always have the best book recommendations. And I actually
They're all
think one of
sad and gay.
true, and I love all of them. They're all very on brand. So I appreciate that, and you've been we've kind of had a little book club for a while
Yeah,
to discuss.
yeah,
So I'm
yeah,
happy to be talking. So I had a few questions.
yeah.
Had you read the play though, or had you only seen it?
So when I was in high school, because I'm a little bit older than you, this Duncan Sheik's musical version of Spring Awakening hit Broadway, and it was like the musical. Like we were all singing it. Like we had the soundtracks. I grew up in Atlanta, so like I didn't have an opportunity to see it until it was on tour. But during high school, I did read the play as a result of having like listened to the soundtrack for the musical so many times.
Okay.
Yeah, so I
What
read
do
it
you
first.
think? Did you think there was like a difference in your experience reading it versus like listening to it for the first time or even seeing it for the first time?
Yeah, because I think for me, like in high school, I was going through my own sexual awakening, right? It was my own spring awakening. Like that's
Yeah,
what the
quite
title
literally.
refers to, literally, is like spring. It refers to like the beginning of puberty, the beginning of just like feeling sexuality in general and feeling sexualized, and like the first time you have a crush on somebody, like all of those things are relevant. And so I think for me, the musical had so much like teenage angst in it that I could really relate to, and like anger and frustration and confusion that like does come across in the play, but it's more subtle on the page than it is if you have the opportunity to actually like see it and feel it
Act
and
it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. And listening to the soundtrack after you told me to, I was like, oh, if I had this, like, I wish that I had known about this when I was like in high school and like doing musical theater, because that was so up my alley, and that would have been like my dream play to do.
Oh my gosh, for sure.
Was there a character that you identified with the most?
Yes. It's interesting. I feel like I'm weirdly, because I think people would assume like, oh, like one of the gay characters, but for me, I feel very much this sort of like combination of Melchior and Moritz, because like Melchior has this, like wants to rock the boat, like has all these grand ideas, like writes the book on having sex, right? That gets him expelled from school. And then Moritz is this like also like an extremely like sensitive person, but isn't quite keeping up for whatever reason. And like I very much relate to that, like in high school, especially like this inability to sort of be on the same level in my studies as my peers, even though I was just as intelligent. I just like the actual like academia of it didn't stick to me in the way that it did other people. And I remember that feeling of just like frustration, like no matter how hard I studied. And now I'm sure more to be like someone who probably has like ADD or like has some other diagnosis for education. There's a reason why like certain things aren't sticking in the same way the other kids are, but at the time like, there just wasn't a
competition.
It was either like you're really fucking smart and you get the grades that we get, or you're out of here.
Exactly. And that's like the issue totally with the school system in general. It's really only tests for one kind of intelligence, and like there's so many different ways that you can be intelligent, especially having a brain like yours where you're so creative. And like, we can talk about books forever, but suddenly you go to take like a math test and you freeze up, and you're made to feel ashamed by that.
Right. It's so confusing. It's like my brain can write a movie, but like divide things.
Like what? Yeah,
that's okay.
100%.
Like not everybody is meant to be perfectly skilled in every area of academia.
Of course not. Do you think, you said you grew up in Atlanta, so do you think growing up in a place like Atlanta affected the way that you kind of struggled throughout your sort of spring awakening, or your as you started to go through puberty, have feelings? Like, how do you think your environment and how you were raised affected that sort of part of your life?
I mean, for me, growing up in the South in general is like a far more conservative place than any of the coastal cities, or even like a big city like Chicago that's in the middle of the country, or Paris or London in Europe. There is a lot of bigotry in the South, and there's a lot of miseducation about gender identity and sexuality, and I was not privy to the experience of like having a lot of gay people in my life as a kid, you know, or having a lot of shows to watch or books to read. It just wasn't really on my family's radar, even though I was a pretty queer kid. And so my sexual awakening obviously was a little bit more confusing, but like, thank God I got the internet. You know, like thinking about like when this play was written, and you think about like Hans and Ernst, like they literally didn't have access to things, and like how beautiful is it that they found each other.
And I mean, and being so brave as to opening up and finding each other, but you know, thinking about these kids that literally have these feelings and think there's no one else out there in the world like them, and that there's something wrong, literally wrong.
Or like literally like you've gone through puberty and you still think that like babies are being delivered
by the stork.
By storks. Through fireplaces.
And this like withholding of information that especially Wenla's mom dies, and she really begs her mom. She really gets on her knees and she's like, Mom, please tell me. And her mom she just completely falsely explains how babies are made. And this leads to Wenla's complete downfall because of this like lack of information.
Just complete lack of understanding.
Absolutely.
And, you know, on the other side of that, it's like, Melchior like knew what was going on to a certain degree, but like didn't know about like contraception or other preventative measures.
No. And this is, I think, something so important about like this sort of idea of treating kids like that they don't understand, because we do have, you know, from when I was 11 years old, I was curious about these things and I wanted to know. And thankfully, like the conversation was very open in my family about these things. I think because my parents understood that ignorance is not bliss when it comes to these serious topics, especially like something like contraception. And these ideas of like, oh, let's not tell our kids anything and they won't get into trouble. It's such an old-fashioned idea, but unfortunately in a lot of places, like you were mentioning, you know, in conservative areas like the South, this is still a completely relevant topic that's happening every day.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to talk about, I have like different larger themes that I found throughout the book. So sexuality was one. I think what these kids are going through, reading it now, I'm like, these are very normal sexual experiences, right? Because we see this stuff every single day, but the kids are made to feel guilty about everything they're feeling and going through. How do you think the school environment, the sort of like religious school, was hurting them? Did you go to a religious school?
I did not. Like I went to a pretty like open-minded school, and I'm really grateful for that. We did have sex education, but we didn't have queer sex education. But it wasn't academically rigorous in a way that like didn't make room for people who were a little bit different on that spectrum. But you know, I think in this, I mean, the issue of morality in general is such a big theme in this play, you know, and like, I think it's like even Moritz talks about it like in the afterlife, right? It's like, it's sublime. You can see, well, that's more mortality, right? But like the morality issue of just like what is right and what is wrong, and it being so black and white for these people, and it being so black and white in this educational system, and so black and white for these parents. But then things get compromised, right? Because like Fanny Gabor is like pretty liberal, like in the play, right? Like she's like, my son didn't do anything wrong. All he did was, you know, talk about things that human beings do, that animals do, that are like the circle of life stuff. Like he didn't do anything wrong until the issue of the rape comes up, right? Or the issue of like the possible rape comes up. That's the way it's skewed. Right? Whether or not that's actually what happened, I think the reality is it's like two teens who don't really know what they're doing, trying a thing out, and like maybe him being a little bit more convincing and her being a little bit more naive. But that for, you know, for Melchior's mom is like a no, hard no. And it's interesting because out of all the adults, she's the only one who's like kind of chill.
I know, and I think like representing a more liberal style of parenting in this book that was or in this play that was written so long ago is like so important, and you know, now like I'm reading her part and I'm like, oh, you know, this is how every parent is, but it's
Yeah,
not.
well,
And
right.
it definitely wasn't then. But you want to think that your parents are just going to defend you till the end. And
Right.
even I think Wendla's mom and dad, their argument sort of about what to do about her, and when they find out that she's pregnant, and the way in which they handled that is a complete contradiction of
The
this.
church.
Yeah.
Completely. It's like completely illegal.
Yeah.
And like
Totally.
sacrilegious.
Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting is like in this time, and there's a lot of countries where there's no separation of church and state like we supposedly have in America.
No.
The church was the rule. It was the school. It was the law. Period. And it
Yeah.
was tied to God and it was tied to religion.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody was
And these
following laws of
characters,
life.
yeah, and some of these characters who are atheists, who bring up very valid points, it was like, you're crazy, you have no, you, there wasn't room for conversation, really. It was like,
Right.
you are reciting Bible verses, or you're completely crazy, you've lost your mind, you should go to jail, you know? And just the way that they handled Wendla's pregnancy, to me, like, was so insane that that was something that could have happened then and could happen now.
It's something that, I mean, these sort of like back alley abortions still happen now because abortion isn't legal in every state. So if you are raped, like Wendla supposedly was in this play, like
she's
that
14.
just when you're 14, right? And so it's the same for certain people in America and other countries who were assaulted or were taken advantage of and become pregnant because of that. They're unable to get the type of services they need because it's not legal. And so then they have to turn to what happened to Wendla so tragically. Is like you have to turn to this. That's the only other option other than like going through with birth. But after such a trauma like that, that's not necessarily something you should have to do.
No, and it's not, you know, I think like this whole idea of pro-choice is very important now. That wasn't even something that was being discussed then, but neither was contraception. So, you know, you have these ideas of expecting children to not go through sexual awakenings, especially as a parent, who, you know, we all have these feelings when we're growing up. So I think to project that on your kids, and then it kind of, there's this quote about how as a parent you have like, you put all these ideas on your kids and then expecting that they'll then put these ideas on their kids, and it's a sort of toxic cycle because no one's really opening up the conversation between children and parents.
Right. And it's like even Moritz talks about it. You know, he's like, I think what he says is like, we see parents bringing up children into the world in order to be able to say to them how lucky you are to have parents like us. You know, how lucky you are. It's like for your own praise.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because like talking about morals, like the masked man character at the end of this play, right, who comes in like to offer hope in a different way. Is like, you don't actually have to die. Like, you're gonna get through this time. I know it's difficult, but if you choose to live, you'll pass through this. And you have the rest of your life ahead of you. Yeah. Like, because when you're a teenager, everything feels so dramatic.
It feels so permanent. Things that you go through as a teenager, like every bump in the road, it feels like this is what I'm destined to do.
Things feel like life or death. And then even
absolutely,
Moritz talks about it where he's like, I regret this. Like, this actually wasn't the choice I should have made.
No, this wasn't the best decision. And, you know, now we have, fortunately, suicide hotlines and support groups and so many resources to go to, but you know, that wasn't something that was available to these kids. So if you started feeling like something was forever, there wasn't someone there to tell you it's not, and you're gonna get through this. So to have that sort of masked man at the end, this character that is their sort of support and resource for telling them that they're gonna go on, was, I think, actually a very progressive way of depicting a character.
Completely. And I love like his definition, or their whatever definition of morals being like the real product of two imaginary quantities, like the imaginary quantities of what you're supposed to do and what you want to do. And the product is morals, and it can't be denied. Like, it's there. Yeah. And like what you want often, or sometimes, or at least in this play, when it comes to sex and expressing your sexuality and wanting to explore sex with people and explore all of those like crazy feelings you have as a teenager, those wants are not what you're supposed to do, and then that makes you morally wrong.
I know, and then it makes you feel ashamed.
Mm-hmm.
To even have thoughts in your head. And like, I grew up, you know, in California, which is a very open-minded place. But even like, you start thinking anything other than like what innocence is technically defined as, and I felt ashamed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure, like, I just think we should talk a little bit about that sort of like sex ed in school, which is, I still think, a very outdated program that they offer. So how was, because I remember I had sex ed in the form of, you know, you're gonna start menstruating, and this is what happens when you go through puberty. It did not talk about desires or wants. It didn't
or like emotional maturity.
It didn't. And there's a really good quote, I want to find it, from the book, that says, I just wanted to call your attention to the fact that even the best things can have harmful effects if a person is not yet equipped with the maturity to properly appreciate them.
Right.
So it doesn't really explain to you the sort of emotional maturity that goes along with these new wants and needs and this sexual awakening that we have. And I think that's something really important that they should start discussing with young people in general.
100%. I mean, I think that's like a big piece of the puzzle that you're trying to put together when it comes to sex and, and like what it means. And also, you know, like this book, you know, talks specifically about heterosexual sex and how it can lead to pregnancy or unwanted pregnancy, right? But it doesn't talk about like STIs or like other things that can come up from unprotected sex. And I know for me, my sex education in high school only talked about straight sex.
Mine as well.
When there is a whole world to be explored about safe sex in same-sex relationships.
Absolutely. And I think
or not relationships.
Another thing that's what leads to the shameful feeling is when you're learning, you know, you will start to have feelings like as a woman. They're like, you're going to start having feelings for boys. There was no conversation about a same-sex relationship.
Right.
And fortunately, like, that's why I think the internet is in a lot of ways a very positive platform, because you can find people who have the same ideas as you. There's a place for everyone. There's a way for you to find someone to relate to. But, you know, when you're in school and you're being told this is what happens to you, and it's not necessarily what happens to you, or you don't necessarily fit into the video that they're showing you or the explanation.
I mean, for me, I was like, well, this doesn't apply at all. Even though there were things I could learn from it, but it immediately shut me off because I was like, well, there's no information here about how I, male-bodied, have sex with somebody else who's male-bodied, and so
and it's this like miseducation that then you go into it without the necessary knowledge, because it's like people, I think especially, it's an old-fashioned way of thinking, but adults in general, they think this misinformation is actually beneficial to us, but it can be so harmful.
Well, it's extremely traumatic. Because then the only way you learn about having sex or sexual experiences is through having that experience. And, you know, as a gay person or a queer person, often that comes from, I mean, it's different now, but like when I was out, like there weren't a lot of out people my age. So I was having experiences with people who were older. It wasn't safe. It wasn't legal. It wasn't appropriate necessarily, but it was what was available to me. And so then I was learning through experience without any book to refer to or like anything else to go off of. And it's the same what happens in this play is it's like they're learning through experience.
Yeah.
Like, they don't really know. Well, Winlet doesn't know at all what's going on.
No.
She's just like, yeah, okay. Like,
she's like, great. All
I
right,
have no idea what you're talking about. And like, I can't be pregnant because I'm not in love with you.
And that's like, that to me was so heartbreaking when I read that, because you know, her mother says, you have to love someone like you've never loved someone before. Right. You know, and you can argue, well, yeah, that's true. But it's such a lack of the essential information, obviously.
Yeah.
And then she says, well, I wasn't in love. And then it's like, well, if you're not, and then she's not in love and she's having these sexual experiences that she's probably not ready for, because, you know, and I think like that's what broke my heart so much, is she was like, but I wasn't in love.
Yeah. And she didn't think, you know, and what's interesting about that is that like sexual experiences and love don't necessarily have to go hand in hand. Sometimes it can just be like a thing that you're exploring and having fun with if you're doing it safely. Which I think is what makes the relationship between like Hanshin and Ernst so beautiful, is that like there clearly is so much like joy here and experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
And
they're learning alongside each other.
Yeah, and there's obviously love there, but it's, I think in a way, because there's nobody's even talking about it. There's no like, don't hang out with the boys. You know what I mean? Like to the girl, it's like they have the freedom at this time to explore each other in a way that has shame, obviously, because it's people of the same sex, but doesn't have the same shame as it would for like opposite sex couples to be exploring sexuality at the same time.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this was something I was discussing sort of this week with my parents, because I just think it's such an interesting idea of like this like slut shaming. And, you know, how you would never say some of the terminology that you'd use to describe a girl than you would a guy.
Right.
You know, and so this idea that Hanshin and Ernst can hang out and they don't say, they're not shamed, no one's questioning it, no one's saying anything, but you know, Wenla's running off and like, how dare she, and she's, you know, it's, that to me is still something that
or like Ilsa's completely excommunicated.
Yeah,
like she gets like beat by her family, you know. She's in 2 scenes, but those are pivotal scenes because she comes back talking about like, oh my gosh, I've been like out in the city and I've been to these clubs and I'm just like, I'm liberated sexually and I love my body and I love these people because these people are like accepting on a different level, and then I have to go home to my small town where like nobody understands me, and it's so painful. Where it's like, it's interesting because she's sort of this like unspoken hero of the kids.
She's like this sort of everything that they wish they could feel, but this confinement of their small town and their more conservative parents is completely prohibiting them from doing. Did you ever feel like, you know, because I know you went to school in, you went to college rather in New York, right?
Yeah.
So did you ever feel like then being in a place like New York, which is super progressive, you know, you are experiencing all these really incredible, very liberating places, parties, whatever it might be, social experiences. Did you ever feel like it was a step back going home, like you sort of had to draw it back a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I did in a way, because there was like a safety issue of walking around Georgia. But to be fair, like I was yelled at on the street in Los Angeles 2 days ago for wearing a skirt, you know, by like a group of like 17-year-olds calling me really offensive gay terms and like threatening to attack me, right? So like location is a thing to a certain degree, but like safety is an issue for queer people regardless of where they are. And you could think, you know, for me, it's like I live in a really progressive city. I'm in a safe neighborhood, like all X, Y, and Z, like, and it's still,
and you want to say, like, I so badly want to say I'm shocked, but it pains me to say, like, I'm not.
Well, what's interesting to me too is like,
every day.
Right, and what makes so when you look at like media and TV now, when you look at queer, I mean, I'm a very like outspoken queer person. It's part of my identity. It's part of my it's part of everything I do, and I make it a point to do that, and I put myself at risk to do that.
But by the way, if one little boy or girl can see you and think I can be whatever I want to be, it's worth, you know, the risk. That's
right.
Why, like,
well, that's exactly that's the thing that keeps me going, right? Like, that's those it's the next generation of people feel like they have a place in Hollywood, X, Y, and Z. But like on a character level, that's what makes Hanshin so real to me, is because like he is queer, and he talks about like his personality, and he's like, I'm not rocking the boat. Like, I'm staying under the fucking radar. I'm not challenging anything. Like, I'm gonna just like bliss out because it's safe.
It is.
That's like the safe thing. I was even watching this Apple series about gay people in media, and Chris Colfer.
Was it Visible?
Visible.
I watched it last night.
Chris Colfer was talking about his character in Glee, and he was like, well, what was nice is that I got to play a gay kid in high school who was really like a gay kid in high school, who's more quiet and more reserved at first, and who's like just trying to sort of like get by
Mm-hmm.
and like not draw too much attention to themselves because they want to be safe.
Yeah. And actually I thought Visible was amazing because it just depicts how the media was talking about issues sort of surrounding the LGBTQ plus community. They weren't even televising Stonewall, which was such a pivotal moment for queer culture and history. And, you know, at first, these characters were depicted in the media as like a joke. They were like the butt of the joke. And I think how far we've come where there are realistic, you know, you can be the love interest. You don't have to be the funny friend, or you like look back at these shows like All in the Family, which is one of the ones that they were talking about in Visible.
Yeah, All in the Family, yeah.
And these characters are so flamboyant and, you know.
Right, they're insane. Because even though I dress really flamboyantly, like my personality isn't always like, you know, whatever that's supposed to mean.
And sitting there, like, watching your family laugh at what you don't find a joke.
Right.
It can be extremely traumatizing. And I think that's why, like, having a character like Ernst so early on that was more reserved, that wasn't like this and that, you know, like it was a real thing and a real person with real feelings. Depicted in a way that made people read this. And even though it was very controversial when it was running and went to stage production, but like there were people out there sitting in the audience that were probably like, oh wow, you know, I'm not the only one in the world like this.
Right.
And I just would like to say, like, you were a very big part, I think, of my like spring awakening. And like you, like, truly, you were like my Ilse or whatever. And just like explaining that there doesn't have to be a name or a set category for your place in the world, because if there isn't, you make one. And that's what I was so appreciative of you for, is like showing me that you don't have to be this or that or black and white. And just like the characters in this play, who all are finding their own place in over a very different spectrum with very different beliefs, but at the end of the day, they're like discovering who they are. And that's something that you showed me how to do. And like, that's why I'm so appreciative.
Well, I'm so appreciative of you. Because you're like such an open-minded and loving and accepting person. And you've developed your own moral compass that isn't inherited. I mean, it's inherited from family, but it isn't like a prescribed moral compass from some institution that's been centuries old that hasn't evolved. And you have, you know, the ability to continue to see things differently and grow in a way that's just like so inspiring and exciting, as a friend of yours.
You're gonna make me cry.
And also to no! Oh, no! But I think you know, it's interesting too, because it's like there's so many prescribed gender roles now, and it's like I'm seeing people in the comments where it's like, well, why do you wear a skirt? It's like, well, skirts were worn by men for centuries.
Yeah.
Before they ever wore pants.
Really, I know.
So like, I don't. It doesn't make
Talk about
sense.
ancient Greece, you know?
Like educate yourselves. You're being ignorant.
And that's, I think, the biggest thing is like this sort of ignorance now does not apply geographically anymore, because we all have access to the necessary information to lead a safe and understanding and empathetic life. And I just think like we all need to have a little bit more empathy.
Yeah.
Just like, you know, the one parent in the play who's understanding, and then you see all these other people, and unfortunately, like, we like to believe based on where we live, and I think that, you know, the industry that we're a part of, that everyone is as open-minded as us, but unfortunately it's not the reality, because you still see things happening every day that are heart-wrenching but not surprising, and that's, I think, the most painful part of it. Well, this was so deep and intense, but I would not want to talk about these issues with anyone else.
Same.
I love you.
I love you so much.
So much.
Thank you for including me in this.
You can be a special guest, a reoccurring guest, whenever you want. I will talk to you about any book or play ever.
Down.
And if you have any recommendations, please give it to us. The book club wants more Rex.
I will.
I was thinking we could do On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous for one of them.
Ooh, you should do a double. Ocean would love to do that with you, I'm sure.
I would because that
I
is
mean,
what
I don't know if you've DM'd with him before, but he's like always on.
Okay,
he's so smart.
I'm gonna reach out because I love that. I mean, I like have to apologize in advance for the people reading it because you will cry, but it's such a good one.
Yeah. Oh, well, I love you so much. Thank you for
I love you more. I'm giving you like a big virtual hug because I feel like we just had like a very deep conversation.
I know.
So much.
I'm gonna need to like go journal now.
I know, I'm gonna journal too.
All right,
I love you so much.
I love you too. I'll see you soon.
Bye. Well, thank you guys so much for listening to us get very deep. We're clearly both very passionate about a lot of the issues discussed in this play. I know they're tricky things to talk about, but I'm so grateful to have such an incredible audience that I think shares a lot of these same values with me. You guys are, so wonderful and like the reason why I feel so grateful to be part of this world. And yeah, so thank you for being part. I know this was a heavier book club. Who knew Spring Awakening would be the one to get me pretty much to tears, but I will announce the next book tomorrow, and let's keep it going. I love your guys' recommendations. I look at all of them, so you guys DMing me whatever, books, I'm writing all of them down, and I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. So, this is supposed to be a collaboration, and I'm so grateful to how you guys have responded to this. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next Friday.